They didn't die from bullets. They died from the snow. In the winter of 1942, the city of Stalingrad stood frozen under a grey sky. Smoke still curled from its ruins. The Volga River lay half buried in ice, and silence hung over the endless rubble. Deep inside that silence the remnants of Germany's Sixth Army were fighting not against the Red Army anymore, but against hunger, frost, and time itself. They had arrived in summer confident and proud, believing they would conquer the East within months. But now, in this dead winter, they were ghosts, half-starved men staring through frost-bitten goggles at a world of white death. What happened here was not just a battle. It was a slow collapse of an empire's illusion, buried one soldier at a time, under layers of snow. This is the story of Stalingrad's frozen army, told through the letters. They wrote the maps they drew, and the silence they left behind. In the summer of 1942, the road to Stalingrad shimmered under the southern sun. Dust followed the steel tracks of the German Sixth Army, an unstoppable force of more than 300,000 men moving east, their helmets bright, their engines confident. They believed they were marching toward victory, toward the final collapse of the Soviet Union. Hitler himself had promised that Stalingrad would fall within weeks. It was not just a city, it was a symbol, a name that carried the weight of Stalin himself. In Berlin, radio announcers called it the key to the Volga. At the front, soldiers called it something simpler, the end of the road. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus crossed the Don River with music playing from field radios. The air was hot, dry, and filled with the smell of gasoline and dust. Columns of panzers rolled east as Luftwaffe bombers darkened the horizon. By August 23rd, the first waves of German aircraft reached Stalingrad. What followed was not an attack, it was annihilation. In just 48 hours, more than 40,000 civilians were killed as the city burned. The Volga turned red with oil and fire, streets vanished. Entire neighborhoods were flattened into deserts of brick. Inside the chaos, civilians dug shelters beneath collapsed houses. Women carried water in buckets made from shell casings. Children helped soldiers build barricades from doors and furniture. To the west, Paulus's men entered the outskirts of the city. They moved among the ruins, expecting no resistance, and found instead the Soviet 62nd Army waiting inside every shattered building. Combat became intimate, brutal, almost personal. A city block could change hands 5 times in a single day. A factory wall might separate 2 armies. Rats fed on corpses, then on the rations of the living. What was meant to be a quick triumph became a maze of destruction. Every metre of ground was bought with blood. As the summer heat faded, German confidence began to cool. By October, the nights grew longer, the air colder, and the Volga froze slowly under the first breath of winter. None of them knew it yet, but the same streets they had conquered in August would soon become their graveyards in January. November 19th, 1942. Before dawn, the horizon west of Stalingrad glowed faintly blue. In the frozen trenches beyond the Don River, thousands of Soviet guns waited under camouflage nets. For weeks they had been silent. That morning, they spoke all at once. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the ground shook with the roar of more than 3,500 artillery pieces. The Soviet counterattack code name Operation Uranus had begun. The German soldiers in the outer defenses thought it was just another barrage. But this was different. Within minutes, entire regiments of Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the German flanks were obliterated. The ice cracked under the shells. Horses and men disappeared in white smoke. To the north and south of Stalingrad, 2 Soviet fronts advanced simultaneously. General Rokossovsky's Don Front and General Yeremenko's Stalingrad Front. Their target was not the city itself. It was the open steppe behind the German lines. Within 48 hours, the jaws of the trap began to close. From the north, the 5th Tank Army cut through the Romanian 3rd Army. From the south, Soviet mechanized units swept across the frozen Kalmyk steppe. On November 23rd, the two pincers met at the small town of Kalach-on-the-Don. In that moment, the German 6th Army was encircled. More than 300,000 Axis troops, Germans, Hungarians, Italians, and Romanians, were trapped in what would become known as the Kessel, the cauldron. At first, Hitler refused to believe it. He ordered Paulus to hold his ground, promising that the Luftwaffe would keep the army supplied by air. Hermann Göring claimed that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. The real number was barely 80. Inside the pocket, the men watched as food, fuel, and ammunition vanished. Horses were slaughtered. Frozen meat was hacked apart with bayonets. Medical supplies ran out. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. By early December, starvation and frostbite killed more soldiers than Soviet bullets. The snow itself became a weapon-burying supply dumps, freezing rifles, silence and trucks. Paulus, a meticulous man by nature, kept daily records even as his army disintegrated. His handwriting grew smaller, shakier, colder. Morale deteriorating rapidly. One entry reads, "No bread for 3 days." Fuel nearly exhausted. Wounded freezing to death in tents. Outside the ring, Soviet troops tightened the noose. The 64th Army captured Pitomnik airfield, cutting off the last route for evacuation. Planes that tried to land came under fire before touching down. By Christmas 1942, the German soldiers inside the city knew the truth. They were not waiting for rescue. They were waiting to die. On New Year's Eve, Soviet loudspeakers blared across the frozen lines, calling out in German, "Surrender. For you, the war is over." No one answered. Only the wind replied. By mid-December, Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a tomb made of ice. Inside the encirclement, the German 6th Army existed only in fragments, broken units, disconnected voices on dead radios. The city that had once been their objective had become their prison. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Weapons jammed. Diesel froze solid inside the tanks. Even the dead remained standing, frozen upright in the ruins. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags torn from curtains, tablecloths, even Soviet flags captured months earlier. Their hands cracked open from frostbite. Their boots disintegrated. Food became more precious than ammunition. A single loaf of bread, made from sawdust, barley, and ground horse meat, was divided among 6 men. Horses disappeared first, then dogs, then rats. In one report recovered after the war, a medical officer described the final stage of starvation. The men lose the will to talk. They sit motionless, staring. Their faces turn grey, and the smell of decay becomes constant. In makeshift hospitals, little more than cellars lit by candles, surgeons worked in gloves stiff with frozen blood. There was no anesthesia left. Operations were done by instinct and mercy. The Luftwaffe still promised supplies. Each day they came, planes roaring through blizzards to drop crates from the sky. Most missed their targets, landing in Soviet lines. The few that reached the pocket carried everything except what was needed: boots instead of bread, radio parts instead of medicine. Pitomnik Airfield, the 6th Army's last lifeline, became a vision of hell. Hundreds of wounded men lay on the snow beside the runway, waiting for planes that never landed. When one did, the engines never shut down. Wounded men were dragged aboard while others were pushed away with rifle butts. They screamed for space, wrote one mechanic, but there was none left, not even for hope. The letters home continued until the very end. A soldier named Wilhelm, 23 years old, wrote to his mother on December 28th. The snow has stopped falling. The silence is strange. We still have faith in our Führer, but food is gone. If this letter finds you, I want you to know I am not afraid anymore, only cold. He would never post it. Soviet troops found it inside his greatcoat 2 months later. Meanwhile, Soviet loudspeakers echoed across the snow. Germans, lay down your arms. You are surrounded inside the ruins. No one moved. Pride was all that remained, and even that was fading. The men began to dream while awake. They saw food, warmth, home. They spoke to comrades who had already died. Entire squads vanished in the snow while searching for firewood. By mid-January, the Sixth Army was no longer an army. It was a frozen collection of bodies, memories, and whispers. The commanders in Moscow called it victory. The men inside called it something else. The end of the world. The snow kept falling, and the letters kept coming. Even as the Sixth Army collapsed, the men of Stalingrad continued to write. They wrote on scraps of paper, on ration wrappers, on the backs of Soviet propaganda leaflets. Most of those letters never left the pocket. The men who wrote them never left either. Their words were found months later, frozen inside coats, folded between photographs, hidden under boots in the snow. Letter 1. Private Franz Müller, 24, Infantry, 305th Division, December 21st, 1942. My dearest Anna, I have not seen the sun in 10 days. The sky is white, the ground is white, even our faces are white. The snow gets inside everything, our rifles, our food, our lungs. Sometimes we shoot not at men, but at shadows moving in the smoke. They tell us to hold, but hold what? There is nothing left to hold, except our fear. If this reaches you, remember me as I was in summer, when the fields were green and the birds sang over the Don. Letter 2. Nurse Liesel Weber, Field Hospital, Potomnik Airfield, December 28th, 1942. Mother, I can no longer wash the blood from my hands. It freezes before it melts. We have no morphine left. The men bite down on belts while we operate. One begged me to kill him when we finished. I told him he would see home again, though I no longer believe it myself. Letter 3. Oberleutnant Hans Kruger, 14th Panzer Regiment, January 3rd, 1943. To my father, I have received your last letter from Dresden. Please tell Mother not to worry. We are surrounded, yes, but we are still soldiers of Germany. We will fight to the end, because it is what we are taught. The men still salute. We still sing, though our voices tremble from the cold. If we fall, it will be in the ruins of Stalingrad, not on our knees. Letter 4. Unnamed Soviet soldier, 62nd Army, found in 1943. They say the Germans are starving. I see them sometimes, grey shapes in the snow. I feel pity for them, but I cannot stop shooting. My brother died here last week. He was 19. If I live, I will never hate again. I will only remember the cold. By the end of January, no more letters were written. The pockets were searched by Soviet troops weeks later. Many letters had turned to pulp, unreadable. A few survived. Historians would later say that they were the last voices of the Sixth Army. Not orders, not battle reports, but whispers from men who wanted to be remembered as human beings. "We are not heroes," one wrote. "We are just tired." And in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, their words finally found silence. January 1943. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. What remained were frozen positions marked on maps that no longer mattered. General Friedrich Paulus, once the architect of precision, now sat in the cellar of a bombed-out department store, the new headquarters of a dying army. His uniform was immaculate. His eyes were hollow. On January 31st, Soviet troops stormed the basement. When they entered, Paulus did not stand. He simply removed his pistol from the table and placed it in front of him. "The war is over for us," he said quietly. 2 days later, the northern pocket fell. More than 90,000 men marched into captivity. Behind them lay 150,000 dead, frozen where they had fallen. Soviet soldiers moved through the ruins, stunned by the silence. They found field hospitals filled with corpses still strapped to operating tables, command posts littered with diaries and maps, horses frozen mid-stride. The Volga was no longer red, it was white, and it carried no sound. For Germany, it was the greatest defeat in its history. For the Soviet Union, the first taste of irreversible victory. For the world, Stalingrad became a new word for hell. The battle had ended, but for 90,000 survivors of the Sixth Army, the suffering was only beginning. When the guns fell silent, the prisoners were gathered on the frozen steppe outside the city. Most were too weak to stand. Their faces were hollow, their eyes glassy, their breath visible in the cold air, like ghosts leaving their bodies. The Soviets called it the March. Dozens of columns of German, Romanian, and Hungarian prisoners were ordered to walk east, hundreds of kilometers through snow and wind, toward collection camps deep inside the Soviet Union. They had no winter clothing. Many wore rags. Some had no boots. A Soviet officer later recalled, "They did not look like soldiers. They looked like snowmen who had lost their shape." Along the roads, the dead were left behind, covered by drifts before morning. The ones who fell were not shot. They were simply stepped over. One prisoner wrote later, "We began as an army. We ended as a procession of shadows. Each step forward was an act of will. Each night was a negotiation with death." After days of walking, they reached Beketovka and Gumrak, where temporary camps had been built from shattered brick and wire. There was no heat. The snow inside the barracks never melted. Food consisted of a handful of frozen millet soup twice a day. The weakest died first. Others followed. By the time the prisoners reached their final destination, camps in Tambov, Saratov, and deep Siberia, less than half were still alive. The rest had vanished into the steppe, buried where they fell. For the guards, it was war's justice. For the prisoners, it was purgatory. The survivors who endured the first months described the same sound, the endless creak of wind across the frozen plains. One officer wrote, "We feared silence more than death. In silence, you could hear the snow eating the world." Years later, a handful of men would make it home. Most never did. Out of 90,000 who marched east from Stalingrad, only about 5,000 ever returned to Germany. Their journey became known among historians as the Death March of the Steppe. For the world, the battle had ended. For them, it never truly did. When the smoke finally lifted from Stalingrad, there was no city left to see. From the Volga to the western steppe stretched nothing but ruins. Twisted steel, crushed stone, the bones of soldiers and civilians fused into the frozen earth. Soviet photographers who entered the city in February 1943 called it the Cemetery of Walls. Out of a pre-war population of 500,000, only 1,500 civilians had survived in the rubble. Most of them living underground, in cellars and sewers, emerging only when the shells stopped. Yet in Moscow, Stalin gave a single order: Stalingrad must live again. And so began one of the greatest acts of reconstruction in human history. The first to return were the women, widows, nurses, and labourers. They came back with shovels, not rifles. They dug through the ruins, searching for family, for memories, for anything still alive. The cold wind that once carried death now carried the sounds of hammers. In 1944, students and engineers from all over the Soviet Union arrived to rebuild the city brick by brick. There was no machinery. They used their hands. They melted snow for mortar. The Red Army provided trucks and cranes salvaged from the front. German prisoners of war, those who survived the camps, were brought back to help rebuild what their army had destroyed. Together, enemies and victors worked side by side under the same grey sky. By 1947, new housing blocks began to rise where the ruins once stood. A statue of a woman holding a sword, "The Motherland Calls," was planned to stand atop the city's highest hill, Mamayeva Kurgan, as a monument to both sacrifice and rebirth. The people who had endured the siege said they could still hear echoes under the ground, the voices of those who never left. But above the earth, life had returned. The river Volga flowed again. Children played where tanks once burned. The city had been reclaimed not just from the enemy, but from death itself. In every rebuilt wall of Stalingrad lay a simple truth. What was broken by war could still be made whole by human hands. It took 12 years for the war to truly end for the men of Stalingrad. In 1955, the last German prisoners who had survived captivity in the Soviet Union were finally released. Out of the 90,000 men who had marched east in 1943, fewer than 5,000 returned home. When they crossed the border into West Germany, there were no parades, no bands, no flags. They stepped off the trains in silence, gaunt, pale, older than their years. Some had forgotten how to speak German. Others flinched at sudden noises, as if artillery still echoed behind them. The world had moved on. Cities had been rebuilt. Children had grown. Wives had remarried. For many, home was no longer home. A soldier named Heinrich Bauer, one of the last survivors, later said, "When I came back, my street was gone, my parents were gone, my country was gone. I thought I had returned, but I was still lost." In Soviet records, these men were called repatriates. In German newspapers, they were called ghosts of the Volga. Psychologists would later describe a phenomenon unique to them: the Stalingrad syndrome. A condition born from guilt, trauma, and survival, the pain of being alive when everyone you knew was not. Many of them spent the rest of their lives searching for meaning. Some joined peace movements, some wrote memoirs, others stayed silent forever. Their stories slowly emerged in the 1960s, when families began to open boxes that had remained sealed for decades. Inside were the letters that never reached home, now yellowed and fragile, and photographs of faces that time had already erased. In 1963, One survivor returned to Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, to stand where his regiment had perished. He brought no flag, no uniform, only a handful of wildflowers. He placed them on the ground and whispered, "We came as soldiers. We left as shadows. Forgive us." The wind from the Volga answered him with nothing but silence. It was the same silence that had followed them home, the silence of the dead who never stopped marching. Time did not erase Stalingrad. It only changed its name. In 1961, the city was officially renamed Volgograd, but the memory of Stalingrad refused to fade. For millions of Russians, it remained the sacred ground where the tide of war had turned, where the Red Army stood when the rest of the world had fallen silent. Every brick of the rebuilt city hid a memory. Every street carried a name from the battle: Chuikov Avenue, Pavlov's house, Mamiev Hill. On the hill overlooking the Volga, the statue "The Motherland Calls" was completed in 1967. It stood taller than the Statue of Liberty, sword raised to the sky, her face fierce and grieving. For the survivors who returned that year, it was not just a monument. It was a grave marker for the hundreds of thousands who never came home. In the decades that followed, Stalingrad became part of the world's conscience. For the Soviets, it symbolized heroism. For the Germans, it symbolized tragedy. For historians, it became proof that wars are not won by strength alone, but by endurance, and by the human will to survive. The lessons of the frozen city would shape generations of soldiers, politicians, and ordinary people. It taught the world that courage and suffering are twins, inseparable, inseminated by the same fire. Every year on February 2nd, the anniversary of the surrender, the city falls silent. Sirens wail across Volgograd. Veterans stand with medals on their coats. Children carry red carnations to Mamayev Kurgan and lay them beneath the statue's shadow. The wind that once carried the sound of war now carries the echo of remembrance. And as night falls, the river Volga reflects the lights of a living city, proof that even from the ashes of total destruction, humanity can rebuild. One Soviet poet wrote in 1946, "We buried death beneath the snow and built our homes on top of it. We live, and that is our victory." Stalingrad is no longer a place. It is a heartbeat, frozen once, but never silenced. The frozen city did not die. It learned how to remember. There are places in the world where silence has weight. Stalingrad, Volgograd, is one of them. Beneath its streets lie layers of time, the bones of soldiers, the foundations of homes, the ashes of hope, the roots of rebirth. When winter comes and the snow covers Mamayev Hill, the city seems to hold its breath. Locals say that if you listen closely at night, you can still hear it. The distant rumble of artillery, the faint cries, the heartbeat of a million ghosts beneath the ice. But it's not the sound of war anymore. It's the sound of memory, a whisper from those who never returned. We were here. We lived. Remember us. Every flake of snow that falls on Volgograd is a letter from the past, fragile, fleeting, but infinite in meaning. Because in the end, the story of Stalingrad is not about nations or victories. It is about people, ordinary men and women who faced the unthinkable and still chose to live. The river flows, the city stands, the world moves on. But under the snow, the echoes remain. This was Stalingrad. This was humanity at its darkest and its brightest.